If you're ready to unlock more better days, to take control of your health, to push past your limits and unleash your full potential, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Bettel. For over 2 decades, I've worked with elite athletes and high performers, helping them optimize their bodies, strengthen their minds, and recover from setbacks. Now I'm bringing that expertise to you through the Vitality Collective podcast. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the science, strategies, and real-world solutions you can apply right away. Whether it's enhancing your physical performance, avoiding or recovering from injury, sharpening your mental edge, or simply feeling your best every single day. With insights from top experts and thought leaders, this podcast is designed to help you take action, feel better, and live the life that you deserve. Welcome to the Vitality Collective podcast, where every day is vital.
Today I'm joined by Dr. Robin Thorpe, former head of recovery and regeneration at Manchester United, and one of the people who helped build the scientific foundation for recovery in elite sport. In this episode, we get into what recovery actually means physiologically, why context should drive every intervention decision, and why stacking recovery modalities is probably not helping the way you think that it is. If you're someone who's been relying on a wearable score to tell you how you feel, or you want a more rigorous way to think about recovery in your own life, this episode is for you. Let's get into it. Today, my guest, Dr. Robin Thorpe. I'm so excited for this conversation. We first met, I think it must have been 2012, and I was with the Nets at the time and came back. I was coming back to visit family and did some visits. And I drove up to Manchester to meet Robin at United's training ground. And I'm a lifelong United fan. So that was a big day for me.
I think it was actually an international break as well. And I was coming in on a couple of potentially well-earned days off to have a good conversation. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely loved it, mate. And it was one of those pivotal moments, I feel like, in my career where you really opened my eyes to the science and the structure that can go into recovery. And just watching your process and how you'd set that up at United, it was the first time I'd really seen it in that much detail. And so, first of all, mate, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. And just tell us a little bit about that role at United and how it evolved into the deeply scientific structure that you'd put into it.
When I did a research master's around 2007 time, and that it was it was a paper that we published in the end, but it was around what were the immune, endocrine, and muscle damage responses to competitive soccer and football, and we published it. And I had actually, at that time, I was a keen football fan, or whatever you want to say. Like, I just loved it. Really, that was the kind of, there started to become a few practitioners working professional football in the Premier League. So originally there was only really fitness coaches, and then there started to be one or two practitioners under this sports science kind of title. So I wrote down names, landline telephone numbers, even like facts of those kind of people and in the different teams. And luckily for me, Man United were the most interested in that work. And at that point, it was just like, I've done this work, it's novel, it's published, and I think there's real transferability into what people are doing at the highest level. And it was also the first study, I think, in the UK that used GPS to track the demands of the football game. So luckily for me, Man United and Tony Strudwick in particular was really interested, and there was an opportunity and a role that was going to come up, and kind of, I was the lucky one to get that. And so that was kind of, back to your question around how it started, that probably started my interest and passion in this topic of recovery.
Right.
But I think it really got brought to life was when I was in the role at Manchester United. The head coach at the time, the manager, Sir Alex Ferguson, he would always have this question for our performance department of, well, are the players ready? Like, and then we could intuitively give a decent response, but we never really had the real intelligence. So based off that kind of key stakeholder question from the most important person at the club, then I went down a PhD route, kind of on the side of the day job, to basically answer that question. So that really involved how can we best track and monitor fatigue recovery, understand the various systems that kind of underpin this real global topic of recovery, and then also how do we then manage players and accelerate the recovery of players so that they can compete at the highest level. And when you're playing 3 games a week for most of the season,
Right.
that topic is a real competitive edge for a team who can really understand a little bit more about those processes. So yeah, that was the kind of the way up into that role. And then when you came, I think we just redeveloped the Carrington training ground at that time.
That's right.
And we incorporated this space, which we termed the monitoring lounge. Because previous to that, we'd had, I think, the first BASES accredited lab in the Premier League, set up with a partnership with Liverpool John Moores and the staff that we had at the time, which was great for profiling the players from sort of physical quality and capacity points of view. But when it came to like monitoring them more frequently, we needed a space that was a little bit more accessible for players, more kind of welcoming, less clinical, and fitted with the right tools and technology, and also non-technology, to track where they were at. So yeah, and that when you arrived, that was kind of, I think it had only been kind of there for a short period of time, but that was one of the most, I think, one of the pieces of my time there that I was very proud to be a part of, because that was really an innovative next generation of how you do track athletes at the highest level.
I think that's what I was really taken with when you were showing me around. That was, you'd built out the space for it, and I had started introducing some technology into the NBA for the first time, and subsequently into the NHL for the first time. And it was really clear to move from a lab that people sort of go to on occasion and actually put it into the workflow of the day was a real shift in how we were using technology, and a shift sort of from these timestamps that we would have, once a year, you're going to go into this funny room and you're going to get on the bike and do this test, versus we're going to do a battery of tests much more frequently. And it's sort of going to be a part of your day, and something that feels very natural.
Yeah, and a big part of it was moving away from terming it testing as well, or assessment. And that's also something in years after this time point, in different points of my career and in different roles, and particularly in leadership roles, how like terminology of various processes or systems actually makes a big impact, not just for the athletes, but also for staff working in those areas as well. So yeah, it was a fantastic time. And I probably think that the space, as in whether it's the science of recovery or understanding how players and also just humans respond to stress and load, I don't think it's moved on that much, to be honest, in the last kind of 15 years since that time. Because we started this project back in sort of 2009, so we're going back a few years now. So it's
that's interesting, because we've talked over the years as I've moved out of sport and started bringing those principles into the general population. It's a very, very muddy world as we're seeing the matriculation. I think a lot of companies are seeing new markets in the general population and thinking, okay, we'll take this recovery modality or this device that's been used with pros, and we'll just put it on everybody's wrist. Right. And I think that's where we can really be challenged, because Man United had you, right? The Nets had me. We were there to interpret and actually just give people things to do. So now we're out in the real world and everybody's talking about recovery. You've got Garmin, you've got Whoop, you've got Aura, all these different things giving you a recovery score. What is it, right? What exactly are we talking about? Because everybody's saying the term, not sure everyone really understands it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting point because, I mean, like I say, I started my PhD in this area back in 2009, and I'm still learning and honing my knowledge around what recovery is. And
yeah,
I mean, that's such a huge rabbit hole to leap into. But the fact that now also consumers, just general population, have access to some of these tools and also the metrics that are computed within these tools, it is also a big topic for debate. Because if you are allowing, and I'm not even talking about athletes now, I think the athlete having visibility of some of these things and not really understanding the extent to which these metrics either provide reliable and impactful information relevant to that athlete, but for the general consumer and population, it's certainly probably accelerated more than or at a pace that is out surpassed, let's say, our real knowledge of how it can impact. And I think heart rate variability is a great example of that, and how it's become kind of very dumbed down to become very simplistic of, if you see a directional change in HRV, then it's either associated with a positive or a good thing, or a negative and a bad thing. And it's really a lot more complex than that. And again, we've shown and I think a lot of I think the work that we did some years ago, I think does show how complex these sort of tools and metrics can be. And that directional change can be very different to you, to me. And we actually may want to have a reduction in HRV leading up into competition. So the fact that
even as we have this conversation, Robin, right? Everybody now has this HRV number either on their phone or their Whoop, whatever it might be. What exactly is it? Just for people listening, we're throwing the terms around like now they're just in the vernacular of the general population. But again, it's just a number on a screen for people. And I get asked all the time, well, what should it be?
Yeah.
What are you trying to do?
Yeah. Well, I think to explain it to explain it as simple as possible. I think a lot of people think that, like, your heartbeat, there's the same time in milliseconds between each heartbeat. And what actually happens is there's a lot of variability where the word comes from, but in that time in milliseconds between each beat of the heart. And so historically, there's been work and research that shows if there's a lot of variability in that time between each beat, that is associated with, mainly it was positive health outcomes.
Right.
And also, if that time between each beat was very consistent and similar, that was also associated with quite negative health outcomes.
So that would be a low HRV versus a high HRV. With
exactly.
Low being bad and high being good.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the most kind of, I would say, straightforward ways of describing what it is. But then there's also, dependent on that information, the time point at which you measure this. Also, there's other different contrived calculations to provide a different number that is classed as HRV. There's also people also multiply a factor to that as well to provide a number which seems to look like it's between 0 and 100 for obvious reasons, to kind of use a percent type of framing of that value. So yeah, there's many ways of which it can be done, and there's certainly many ways that it's done differently currently, and not just in the science but also on the market with these different tools.
And so as we go through this, it's a very complex metric, and I think it's way overdone. And even the timing, like a lot of these devices are sort of sampling it at very short windows through the night, or giving you your nocturnal HRV. I think that it's a very confusing metric that is actually quite hard to impact. And we start worrying about these numbers, and I see it across the board. Like this watch, if I go out for a walk, it'll tell me I need 48 hours of rest. Right. And why? Right. And I think we need to really start looking at what kind of recovery do we need. We have internal and external load stress that's applied to the body. We have mechanical stress, all these different things. We have psychological stress, more physiological, right? So are there differences in the kind of recovery that sort of match that kind of stress?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing when we discuss or we talk about recovery is understanding what we really mean by that. And I think the first thing to think about is whether it's a physical or psychological stressor that has an impact on our physiology and biology. And
Right.
normally you would have, if the stimulus is to a certain level, you would have a reduction in function, potentially performance. You'd have some temporary levels of fatigue dependent on the system, and then you return back into your basal state or your homeostasis.
Right.
And I think that's also quite a simple way, and it's a reference really to sort of adaptation theory. But also it's not just the physical stresses that can perturbate this process, and there's also the concept of allostasis, which involves also the psychological impacts, potentially social impacts, and how that can fluctuate and change that return to a basal state or a homeostasis. So I think in its simplest way, recovery is this kind of potentially temporary reduction in function before a return to a normal state. And so as we've researched this and looked into this in more detail, we then look to understand the different tools, methodologies, techniques to try and either accelerate that return, or on the other side, how can we actually amplify some of that adaptation, that stress, to potentially return to a higher state. And so you have that as a kind of singular process in time. And then over a period of time, if you are effective in accelerating this process, you can then over time increase performance and increase your capabilities. The flip side is, with not enough rest or using techniques or potentially having this, I would say, disruption in allostasis, so an allostatic load, you can also then maladapt over a period of time. And that's obviously something that we're trying to avoid. And in professional sport, for example, the chances of this maladaptation over time is becoming increasingly more likely because of increases in the demand of sports, and also I don't want to get into the demand of certain sort of leagues, etc., and the fixture congestion topic. But I think the main point that I've discussed more recently is more of a chronic demand. And whereas when I first started at Manchester United, we may have 6 to 8 weeks off in summer, and players our main problem then was they're going to detrain hugely. Now professional players, particularly in the Premier League, are potentially not getting a rest between seasons. So this season on season load, I think, increases the likelihood of this maladaptation over time, which has consequences to performance, injury risk, etc.
And I think there's a number of really interesting points I want to backtrack on a little bit. I really want people to pay attention to that cycle that you talked about, where we apply a stress, could be cognitive, could be physical, of any sort. The body then dips in function as we have fatigue and, that after impact of training, and then it adapts potentially back up higher. And if we apply that chronically, that's sort of the principle of overload, where where chronically over time, we would see an adaptation where we would train and actually improve our capacity. So the importance of what we're talking about here is that period where we're down, how quick can we recover back up? And that can be cognitive for our mind and our cognitive performance, but can also be physical, which I think is where people tend to lean a little more, is on our physical recovery. I think a really important point is that we actually need the stress. We tend to overplay the recovery piece. I think often we have to know what are we recovering from, right? We don't just always need recovery. We have to have a period of stress and a period of recovery. I think that's an important piece, the balance between the two.
Absolutely. And I think we're probably going to need a terminology reset, I think, in the next period of time as well, because that, like, as we've described through that kind of process, you have adaptation, you have recovery, and really they're one in itself. It's similar. It's the same thing, and this is where, as you start a process to understand it and actually provide or prescribe interventions, the next thing to think about is context, because in certain periods of the year, of the week, whether you're a C-suite executive or whether you're a Premier League player, there's going to be times where you want to try and maximize adaptation. So you want to try and potentially enhance and amplify some of that stress to then have a larger super compensation effect on potentially fitness performance. And then there's times where you're going to really want to consolidate recovery as most effectively as possible. So this context piece is then the second thing that people should be thinking about. And if, for example, and we could maybe use a couple of examples, but if we go for an NBA player, for example, and you're playing 4 games in a week and it's post sort of Christmas time, we're probably not that interested in amplifying adaptations, and we're probably really only interested in how can we recover as effectively as possible, because we've got to play 4 games.
Quick, Robin, by that, what you mean by amplifying adaptation is we're not trying to increase his capacity. He should be about where we need him to be, and now we're trying to maintain that, right?
Exactly, in that time frame, yeah. But again, if that's then a Premier League player in pre-season, where the whole objective, the context of that period of time is around amplifying all these fitness, physical qualities, and so we don't want to reduce any of that stress stimulus.
And you mentioned the C-suite executive. I've got some of my clients now that lead the world in what they do, whether it be in the world of Wall Street or these various other high performing roles. They don't have an on season and an off season, right? It feels to them like they've got to be on all the time, but then with periods of very intense stress. And it's been really interesting how we manage our way through that. But the thing that's a very continuous theme throughout with all of my high performers outside of sport is the lack of recovery, right? They are on all the time. How do you operate and think about that context for these guys who are not necessarily preparing for an event 3-4 times a week, but have to go all day, every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think the commonality is that they're high performers similar to professional athletes. I think that's the key first point. And then it's that kind of piece of like, what are the physiological or psychological systems at play that are most important to their task or to them performing at the highest level. And for example, if we take that C-suite executive role, then and they're on every day, it's probably not going to be any sort of recovery related or demand related to muscular function as it would be maybe a professional basketball or soccer player or football player. So then it's that kind of interrogation of understanding what are the systems at play that need to be accelerated to be able to perform at the highest level all the time. And so if it is a C-suite executive who is having to perform cognitively from a psychological perspective all the time, then how do we understand, number one, how can we track so we actually know there are maybe perturbations in that system or in the status of cognitive recovery or function? And then, well, if we know when the potential decline, or we know when we need to peak, how do we then start to select a range of techniques or modalities to accelerate or to maintain a level of psychological or cognitive recovery? And so it would be that kind of stepwise approach. But I think the first thing that we have to understand is we do have to lean in towards trying to understand which system it is. And it's always been quite intuitive to me and logical to maybe compartmentalize the systems into four. And and one of them is the sort of psychological and cognitive side. There's, from a muscular perspective, there's structural damage of the tissue, and then also metabolic like stresses and fatigue. And then finally, there's a central nervous system component. So although that can potentially be quite simple in other, or from another person's viewpoint, that's normally a good starting point to start to try and understand, right, what's happening and how do we start to track and then improve some of these factors.
Yeah. So can we dive into those four a little bit?
Yep.
How would people know? Right. Let's start walking through this with people. So, I'm high performer. I'm on all the time. I'm hearing this. It sounds amazing. How do I know which bucket I'm in? So maybe we'll go through each one and just sort of guide us through what each one is and how I might understand if that's my area of stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest place to start is if we take a typical athlete, because from an athlete's perspective, we know there's probably going to be elements of each of these systems. And so, for example, if we take an American football athlete, for example, and I think the first place to start is understanding what the external load from a physical perspective is upon that athlete. And so we know we can do that through various tracking devices. And that's kind of your starting point. What did that athlete do in the first place? And that could be over a session. It could be over a full day, a week, a month, a season. I think the next aspect to think about is also what potentially are the psychological and cognitive demands. And so this can be very detailed in some cases. There's actually a piece of work that I'm working on at the moment with a colleague in Australia who's one of the best mental fatigue researchers out there. And really, we're trying to provide a stepwise process of understanding what are those cognitive and psychological demands of not just the athlete and what they're doing, but the environment. So is there enough opportunity to sleep and have high sleep quality? What is the demand on technical and tactical information into the system? So that's probably one that's quite relevant for C-suite profiles, where a lot of the time you're going to be exposed to high levels of information that you have to try and synthesize and produce outcomes, etc. So there can be a stepwise approach to understand actually how much psychological demand is there, because also individuals will respond differently. We know from the kind of early concept that we talked about around allostasis, and some individuals will respond quite well to certain things and some won't, but also the same individual may respond very differently to the same physical and psychological load because maybe there's other factors that are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's where the monitoring really is important, because working with, whether it's a high performer from an exec perspective or an athlete, we're always limited with time. So we have to prioritize. So if you have a C-suite executive who's on all the time, that example you gave us, and you're focusing on structural damage recovery modalities like cold water immersion, like an ice bath, Like maybe that's not targeted, or that maybe you have not matched the right intervention with the stress that individual's going through.
Right.
So I think that's if we go back to our example, so we understand what the athlete may have done. We've then evaluated the environment and their personal ecosystem around psychological and cognitive demand. The next phase is from a physical perspective. What is the effects and influence of that external load? And so structural damage refers to whether it's from a mechanical point of view. So maybe they performed a high level of sprint distance, or the number of sprints, or acceleration, deceleration. We get that eccentric work that's created a mechanical stress, which leads to the sort of structural damage of the tissue. The important factor is that triggers a cascade of a secondary damage phase, which is the immune system. And that's something we can influence. So from a structural damage perspective, that's where cold water immersion and using ice baths appropriately from a protocol perspective, because that's very, we can maybe, if we have time, get onto that. That's something that would be matched to reducing that secondary damage phase in the event of structural damage. And you would do that depending on the context. So if the context is you need to be ready to perform again, that's probably an appropriate decision-making process.
Right.
If you're in pre-season, maybe you want to try and maybe delay this cold water immersion so you're not potentially dampening this stress response.
So we're really looking at that context being important as to even within that one area of recovery, our context as to what we're doing and why, very, very important.
Absolutely. And this is something that is at least a daily decision, because things in professional sport and in life, things change often on a daily basis. So it's the same amount of sprint distance that our NFL player did last week may have a very different response the week after because of potentially social, psychological, or other factors external to the actual load, which we need to understand. And this is where one of the main things that I'm trying to kind of voice educate people on is just using external load alone is not enough. It's not enough to make these decisions. It's a real valuable contributor to understanding what athletes do. How they respond, it will not give you that information, and which is why we need to really understand how these athletes and humans respond. And that's why some of these wearables can be really impactful in the right hands, because they're providing a portion of that context.
Yeah. So we've looked at a couple of those. Of the four, we've talked a little bit about the psychological, the cognitive. We've talked a little bit about the physical and the mechanical. You'd also mentioned nervous system there. What would that present as, or how would we know if that's been a stressor on our central nervous system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I think that's one of those systems which it can be quite difficult to track reliably and also specifically. And this is the key thing with particularly HRV, for example. It's not really specific. Like it's a tool and a metric we can use. It gives us an indication of some change in our physiology, but the specificity of it is quite difficult to ascertain. So from a nervous system perspective, we know from a lot of research and some good studies that process over time, and if we're potentially not recovering or we're not allowing sufficient rest in that singular process, this happens over a longer period of time, we're likely to have a decrement in that central nervous system function. So in terms of monitoring that, it's a little bit more difficult, because often it may also include sort of maximal force output, in which in the sporting environments, at least, that's quite difficult. But I think one aspect to this that's really important to mention, that is, you have specific metrics which can be closely attached to systems, but you also, I think the real intelligence in this system is how some of these interact, and how
Yeah.
potentially there's a cluster or a selection of metrics which, under the right lens and under the right method of sort of tracking the fluctuation, I think that's the key to understanding what happens, because we don't have to go into the topic of complexity. We know biology is complex. I think that's something that gets hammered a lot at the moment around, oh yeah, everything's complex. Well, of course it is. And I think that's always something that, when I did my PhD, that was kind of the first kind of learning and the education, is this is not a cause and effect kind of domain. Things are going to be complex. So I think we should understand that. And maybe that's not well understood for general population and those consumers, but I think in the world of sports performance, I think it should be a given really at this point.
Yeah. And I think it really interesting on that nervous system piece is the length of time you've been exposed to very high levels of stress. And I'm thinking about the psychological stresses right now in a C-suite. If you've been through a 2-3 month period of just relentless stress and pressure, that's probably where that central nervous system piece is going to start showing up, right? And may just present as low mood, really, really fatigued, right? On edge, irritable, these sorts of things.
Yeah. So you mentioned there, Jez, like you've got those like subjective perceptual responses, which, to be honest, are probably the most impactful when trying to determine what's happening. But I mean, we've kind of circled back to HRV a little bit. So one of the other kind of aspects of HRV, and not to get back into the weeds of going low or high, but more variability is an indication of generally more parasympathetic activity or reactivation. And then less variability is also associated with the opposite, so more sympathetic dominant. And basic biology is the more parasympathetic activity that or state that a human can sort of be exposed to, that's an ecosystem which can leverage many of the physiological systems around recovery. Mm-hmm. So I think that understanding that, and I think some of the the nervous system topic is, you could probably use HRV as a guide with the caveat of understanding the individual trends. And then also selecting modalities that may provide increases to parasympathetic activity. But this is also quite an interesting and it's not a very well researched area, because we know there's definitely some techniques that can be used to acutely increase HRV.
Yeah.
So I think the question still remains is, does that short-term positive improvement, does that lend itself to a practical positive outcome when it comes to the nervous system? So that's something that we don't really know yet, but it's probably not the worst thing in the world to practice some of these interventions if you're that C-suite executive who is cognitively stimulated and demanded all the time, and it may be a beneficial process to maybe raise some parasympathetic reactivation or activity via the use of relaxation techniques, mindfulness, certain breathing techniques.
I think that's really important. You mentioned the short-term nature of these states. For me, when we were tracking training load in NHL players, I didn't care if we spiked their training load. There was a lot of fear around, don't go above a certain level, you'll get hurt. I didn't really care if we spiked them. I just didn't want us to stay there all the time. The other thing was, we'd come into these recovery states from a loading standpoint. I also didn't want them to stay here for a long time. Always wanted us oscillating between the two so we could create a positive adaptation. We've given this, I think, the respect it deserves in terms of the complexity and the nuance. If you're a high performer and you hear us talking about it, you might be twisted in knots a little bit listening, right? Well, okay, what do I do? So we've got our areas of stress and we've got our specific recovery areas. How do you then think about applying almost tiers of recovery? I've always thought about them in like our absolute essentials. And for me, and I'd love for you to give an opinion on this. I've always thought sleep and nutrition are essentially our primary recovery avenues. And then we've got our tiers underneath. How would you think about that for each of these areas? And maybe we could start with our physical recovery.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right. I think so adequate rest, sleep, and nutrition for sure fundamentals. They're fundamentals to life. So that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I do think we've been a little lazy recently in recent years, because when it comes to recovery, we kind of say, oh yeah, sleep and nutrition's here, right? It's a given.
Right.
But are we really going into the detail that's needed around that? So that's something that I think, and I'm also working towards to try and provide better frameworks for individuals and athletes and teams to do so. And there's also other interventions that can indirectly improve some of those factors. So, well, if we know sleep's one of the key factors, okay, well, telling someone to sleep more is not a great like method or approach, but there are certainly things that you can guide individuals to improve the probability of sleeping better. So I think that's something that we probably need to do a little bit more of. And also periodizing nutrition. So it's not always like just saying, yeah, optimal nutrition. That's also probably not a good enough approach. And it goes back to the demand. Well, what is the demand and the context, and periodizing, whether it's carbohydrate, substrate, protein, hydrate, all these different things, whether it's going into details in that, that's also something people should probably think a little bit more about. And also, if we're talking about some of the, let's say, muscular changes that we've discussed already, and if we're trying to reduce potentially some inflammatory cascades, are there foods from an anti-inflammatory perspective that can be added in on certain days when that's kind of the key outcome we're trying to achieve? So that's also a lot of work that I'm currently doing in trying to periodize the nutrition interventions with also some of the other recovery modalities that are geared to trying to either reduce potentially inflammation. I'm not talking systemic inflammation. I'm talking about very, very muscular based processes, but also we might also want to be increasing circulation, blood flow in some of our modalities. We've not talked about the metabolic, like fatigue or oxidative stress and things like this, but there's certainly times where it's beneficial to increase blood flow and circulation. So is there some dietary factors we can think about, potentially nitrates, for example? So these are things that I think are emerging. But the other thing that I would also put on that kind of fundamentals of recovery is like psychological rest or reducing that cognitive load. I think that's important, and we've talked about this from an executive point of view. And then the other factor I would say from a more athlete perspective is actually effective periodization of the load. They're your kind of fundamentals from my perspective. So I think we probably need to move away from just saying nutrition and sleep. I think it's key, but it can be a little bit lazy, I think, when if we're really trying to push performance boundaries.
Yeah, and again, what is it, right? It's easy to say but improving your sleep, there's a whole set of behaviors and habits around that, right? I think about the psychological side as well, and the cognitive load. If I've been going all day and challenged cognitively decision making and processing information, and then I come home and sit and scroll Instagram, or I'm on my phone or in front of a screen all night, it's not necessarily rest, right? It's distraction. Right. But I'd love for you to dig into that psychological rest piece a little bit, the cognitive rest. How would you differentiate that? What would that look like for me?
Differentiate between,
well,
from the physical side, or
yeah. So we've got our sleep and our and nutrition, and then you've added in the psychological recipe. So it's not necessarily just go home and go to sleep.
No, I mean, it's this stepwise approach of evaluation and profiling. I mean, what is the environment? Like, are you like, you may find, and it's been talked about for years, and I'll go to an athletic example. Like, if you're, and maybe it was the kind of the college mentality of waking athletes up really early, or you training really early. So what, like, in your regime or your training program, are you even allowing athletes or an exec the opportunity to sleep? Because if you're not doing that, then you're fighting a losing battle. If you don't allow a training regime or a lifestyle the opportunity to sleep, then you're going to start to be struggling. And we know that sleep is going to be that fundamental piece to maintaining or enhancing like a psychological and cognitive recovery. So that's the first place to start. And then I think it's a cascade of profiling athletes as well. And this is not my area of expertise, but profiling an athlete of how much potential cognitive and psychological stress they're going through, and what are the things that maybe worsen that or improve that. But then you can start to sequence modalities around that. And so I'd say, back to your original question, Jez, I think it's intuitive and logical, if players or humans are going through physical or psychological stress, that we try and weave in interventions or the way that we construct our regime, our program, our scheduling, so that we offer times where we can improve that parasympathetic state or that reactivation. And because we can monitor it and track it in a reasonably good way. But we can also start to sequence and cluster certain recovery modalities together as well. And so there is research that shows, like, in sporting populations, that whether it's a breathing, mindfulness, or relaxation technique from as little as 15 minutes to 45 minutes can have that acute positive response. So I think just making sure that you're able to weave some of this in is going to be really important for a kind of base to provide recommendations for performers.
I think that this also starts coming into this, for me, what was always the next tier of recovery, and that's the modalities, the things we do to you versus more what your body does for itself that we can augment. When I was at the Maple Leafs, I'm overseeing everything that touches the athletes. We're all the way through the system, from the big team at the NHL through AHL and all the minor leagues, and tracking our prospects. So I was inundated all the time. It was 24/7. It's text messages, emails, phone calls. For me, what recovery looked like, I would go multiple times a week and go into a sensory deprivation tank, into a float tank. And it was just a 60 to 90 minute period where nobody could contact me. And it felt to me that the best thing that I could possibly do. I came out feeling re-energized and refreshed. So there was a perceived recovery, at least to me, whether it was moving the needle or not, I felt recovered. Conversely, when I came out of sport and we started our company, there wasn't a lot necessarily coming in. There was a ton of work to do, but the stress levels, the anxiety of, we had no revenue coming in, the savings are starting to dwindle. Do we have enough money? Are we going to be able to stay afloat? Me going into a 90-minute sensory deprivation with nothing but my thoughts would have been an absolute disaster, right? So that anxiety, that psychological stress now needed moving, needed up and out instead of grounding into the ground. And so I think the key mistake I made was that I didn't get out, and exercise would have been actually my recovery in that regard. So that, I think, comes all the way full circle back to what's your goal and what's the context of what you're trying to do. And I think it means once we've got these big rocks covered, how we select the modalities next, I think are a really critical piece here.
Yeah, I mean, I know you touched upon there around the cold water immersion topic and the so-called blunting of adaptation. And I think that for hypertrophy, so for increasing muscle mass, doing it straight away, if your objective is to increase muscle mass and hypertrophy, is probably something to think about. Although it's only a dampening of that response.
Right.
And so it doesn't stop it altogether. And so I think,
right.
although when some of that early research came out a few years ago, I think the knee-jerk reaction was like, right, no ice baths during pre-season. But again, that also there's something that crossed my mind sort of 10, 15 years ago. But I think that's also probably a bit of a too simplistic approach. And immediately after, maybe we want to rethink it. But if you have a player who might be on the edge in terms of muscle soreness, structural damage, then it's probably something, you know what, that context changes. It's about consolidating recovery. You might not have an athlete who's highly adapted and they're a youth athlete that's just come into the first team. And you then think about the psychological impact potentially to that physical load. So we return back to this allostasis and this allostatic load. So it really, and it can, I mean, we maybe should have spoke about this at the start. Like the recovery adaptation cycles, probably the most least understood in our kind of our physical and physiological sciences area. But it's also not been given the attention it's probably deserved, particularly now where whether you're a professional athlete with playing more games than you've ever played over a longer period of time, or you're an executive who has to always turn up and deliver outcomes at the highest level from a cognitive perspective. Yeah, it's not been given the attention that it's deserving.
Yeah.
I think training was like that a while ago. And I think now in the last 20 years, there's always like a precursor to training. There's an activation session, or there's a injury prevention session, or whatever we term it, but there's a preparatory piece to training. So I definitely believe in the next sort of years that will always then be the post-training intervention. It won't necessarily it shouldn't be called a recovery session. In some circumstances, yes, but it could also be termed an adaptation enhancer session, where it is that time point where we want to really maximize adaptation. And so, well, actually, you've done your hypertrophy session. To amplify that adaptation, maybe we should start thinking about different temperature-based solutions like heating and raising muscle and tissue temperature to provide different outcomes that are related to gene expression, cellular signaling, etc. So I'm hoping that's the next trend when it comes to how we manipulate training for better outcomes. And again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think the same should be said for that cognitive side as well. And there's work that we've done in the past where can we even stress them from a cognitive perspective doing a physical task that also has the same sort of context and outcome.
Yeah, I think that these are such important directions, and to sort through some of this nuance, because social media and, you know, we've got a lot of so-called science influencers coming out who are putting out very, very early stage pilot-based studies as though, okay, this is what everyone should do to recover from basically everything. And social media is so confident about recovery modalities, right? Whether it's infrared or cold plunge or sauna, everyone sort of has their camp and wants to push this stuff on everyone. I think it's really important. One thing that you mentioned earlier as well is the perception, the athlete's perceived recovery, but also how do they feel, right? The psychological recovery, because we've all got this, and we wake up and we check our sleep score and we check our recovery, and we're letting the device tell us how we feel. How did you handle that, or how would you recommend people handle the readiness, the check-in with yourself side of things?
Yeah, I actually heard something the other day. It was my mate sent it me, and it was like, "Don't be a slave to the stats." And I was like, I kind of like the ring to that, because that's the thing. If there's a wearable that uses a specific data point and then gives you like a green or a red and a percentage, and it says, right, you ready to go or not? Like that's quite high level behavior change and manipulation. So I think you'd want to be very sure and confident that you're understanding what comprises this kind of like, let's go, or like, let's take a rest day. So I think it's difficult. I mean, I think that, as we said earlier on, like I've spent nearly 20 years researching, applying, reading, delivering this type of like domain or on this domain, and still learning, still tweaking approaches. And as we've gone through in this conversation, it can get very complex and detailed. So yeah, to think that there's a one number or a color that can give us that insight is interesting. I think that, going back to the point you made, Jed, I think that has probably triggered that there's probably some, whether they're influencers or content creators or whatever we call them, figures out there who also are proponents for this, and maybe we have to be sure that the right education and background of these individuals and people is at a level to provide these recommendations. Because at the moment, the trends that I see is a lot of very speculative leaps of faith of certain interventions that may have had some clinical research done in a test tube or in a very sort of cellular perspective that showed an outcome or a change. And then so that's kind of been like magnified and extrapolated to, oh, well, this is going to help recovery in this human, in this context, in this situation. So I think we got to be careful a little bit. We've also now moved towards kind of this stacking principle of, well, if I do A, B, C, D, E, F, G interventions all together or one after the other, then I'm going to almost get an additive benefit, an outcome.
Right.
And I think that's something which I'm a little bit concerned about, because I think you might be doing 2 or 3 things that can impact positively the outcome you're looking for, but you've probably just reduced that effect by doing something else. It's important that people are starting to match these interventions with the kind of desired outcomes they're looking for. So the third area would be it's on the same lines of the first one around kind of speculative science being extrapolated. But I think that just because one intervention may change a cellular response and another one kind of goes the opposite way, combining those two things doesn't kind of negate the two.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing quite a lot of that, and also I don't think that, or necessarily in like high performance teams and sports and in that area, because maybe there hasn't been the kind of resources put to this area. I think there's a lot of people and teams who are kind of they're wanting to be guided by maybe the companies or the tech companies who are driving this, and so. Yeah, I think there's got to be a more critical viewpoint on some of this stuff, because I certainly think that applying an intervention at the wrong time has a suboptimal impact on recovery. So could even though you think you are using something to accelerate a return to function or a super compensation in performance, you may think that, but in certain modalities performed at the wrong time, I think you could be doing the opposite, and then you risk potentially maladaptation, etc., etc. And it goes back also to that process of recovery that we've referred to from the beginning. I mean, that timeline is very different for the different systems, the different physiological systems that are demanded. So it's kind of illogical to me that like one intervention is going to solve all those kind of perturbations, and it'll do it at the same time frame or in the same timeline. Like it's just illogical to me. So yeah, we have to make sure we have a more critical viewpoint. And a great example of this, and there was a really good research paper published this year, and so I use this mainly from a leadership perspective, actually, around how to integrate staff departments. So we're really tackling outcomes as a team and not just paying lip service to that. But this paper looked at submerging one limb in cold water immersion in ice bath and one limb in just like thermoneutral temperature water, so like a swimming pool water temperature. And what they found was that in the cold limb, the blood flow and tissue temperature was reduced up to 70%. So tick, that's what we want it to do, because from a muscular perspective, apart from an analgesic perspective and lowering core temperature if it's elevated, we're just trying to like potentially dampen this secondary damage phase. So, and it kind of happens through a cascade of one of the factors is blood flow. So tick, but we also found in that limb that the amino acid incorporation into the muscle cell, so the protein going into the muscle, was also significantly reduced.
Right.
So what I tend to do when I'm working with teams now is I show that to whether it's a physiologist, sports scientist, and then also to a nutritionist or a dietitian. And obviously, well, the dietitian doesn't want, that's the last thing they want. That's the opposite of what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
But it's about outcomes. At that time point, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? Is it to increase protein synthesis, or are we trying to reduce this structural damage piece? And so we go back to the start. We go back to context, what we're trying to do. And that's just something that I think is really important, because I think that's also the kind of one of the starting points of kind of a lack of integration when it comes to performance staff. But also from a consumer perspective, it teaches us to be clear on what you want to do. Like be clear in what we're trying to do. And also, if you're not trying to recover as quickly as possible from tissue damage, so you might want to adapt to the highest level, or you might not have any of the structural damage. It might be metabolic fatigue or a reduction in substrate and glycogen levels. Right. Then cold water immersion is suboptimal. You will recover at a faster rate doing that. So yeah, it's really important and impactful on many ways. So,
Robin, I think this is a great time to go. I know you and I have had many conversations, and there are many more to have. What are the three key things that you would like people to take away from today's conversation? Because we've traveled far and wide on this topic. So what are our three takeaways for people that they can go and put into their life right away?
Yeah. I'm laughing because the funny bit was you warned me you're going to ask this question. And I was like, I'll think about it. And then I didn't. So but I think that's better because it's more authentic that as we've spoken, I can think about it. So the three take home messages, I think right now I'm wishing I thought about it, but I think the key thing from a recovery perspective is the first thing is really the context. So are you looking to recover as quickly as possible, or are you trying to make fitness and physical quality gains? So adaptation. So that's the first. Like the context is really key, because that's going to be your precursor to deciding what interventions, techniques are needed. I think the second thing is making sure you're able to track these changes in fatigue and recovery as astutely as you can. And when I say that, I mean we can't just think of recovery and fatigue as one thing. We have to try and sub-compartmentalize the systems, and that's really important, because if you're dealing with a C-suite exec like we discussed, the likelihood is probably going to be a higher composition of cognitive and psychological load and recovery needed than there is from a muscular perspective, and vice versa with athletes. But with athletes, there's probably things that are going to go on every day. And so every day tracking and monitoring is going to be really, really important and impactful for how you work with those players. And I think the third would be around have a critical viewpoint around some of the methods and techniques that are out there, and just aimlessly stacking and adding modalities is probably not the answer. We certainly have to match that intervention with that system that we're trying to accelerate a return to function or super compensate. So I think being mindful of that and really finding a way to, how can we improve a parasympathetic state, a reactivation following stress as a foundation alongside some of the nutritional factors, some of the sleep and deep rest factors, some of the just training periodization factors. But then you have to try and weave in some of the more nuanced and more specific muscular or nervous system aimed modality. So that third one's, I think, a little bit of a broad area, but there's certainly some interesting so-called stacking of recovery strategies that are going on, which I would hasten to add are probably suboptimal. But with the right 1 and 2 take-home messages, I think you can then start to sequence. So I think it's more sequence, less stacking of recovery modalities. I'll have to trademark that. Quite like it. More sequence, less stacking.
Yeah. And Rowan, where can people find you? Either to get in touch or follow along with your work?
Your classic social media handles. I'm not the best. I think a lot of people say that, but I truly aren't the best, or I'm not the best at posting something. But I do try and highlight and direct people to some of the good work, and whether that's LinkedIn or Instagram. X used to be the place where I'd post the majority of the things that I think are helpful for people. But across those areas, and always welcome to collaborate and work towards some of these things. So it's interesting because the recovery area was where I kind of started, and then I moved away from it a little bit into more kind of the leadership areas where I'm right now. But still involved with some of the research, and it's served me well, and still working with teams, professionals, and trying to maximize outcomes.
Yeah, mate, I can't give you enough credit for really being one of the people who started this area of scientific exploration in professional sport, and it's made such a difference to my athletes, and I know to thousands of other athletes around the world. So, mate, thanks again so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've absolutely loved the chat.
Yeah, cheers, mate. It's been great.
It was an incredibly valuable conversation with Dr. Robin Thorpe. Here are the 3 key things that you can take away from this episode. Number 1, start with context before choosing any recovery intervention. Know whether you're recovering from physical or mental strain, and whether your goal is to recover as quickly as possible or to maximize adaptation and fitness gains. Because knowing the answers to these questions should determine every decision that you make about the recovery tools and timing. Number 2, track the right systems, not just the overall load. Recovery is not just one thing. Try to identify which system is under the most stress, and then monitor and respond to that system specifically, rather than applying a blanket approach. Number 3, sequence your recovery modalities rather than stacking them. Match the right tool to the right system at the right time, and build from your fundamentals before adding complexity. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and leave a rating or a review. It makes a real difference in helping us reach more people who could benefit from these conversations. You can stay connected with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Vitality Collective Performance, where we share additional insights, behind-the-scenes content, and updates on upcoming episodes. The information shared in this episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes to your training, recovery, or health practices. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.